RSVPs. We'll get started in a moment or two, letting folks from all over the world literally join us. Well, why don't we plunge in? We've crossed over 50 individuals coming in to this live webinar, and this will be recorded. My name is Ari Middleman. Over 3.5 years ago, I came up with the, at the time, I thought crazy idea to found BalkanInsider.com, which to this day remains the only morning newsletter covering a region that we all are quite fascinated with. 1 week from today, I'm based here in Washington. 1 week from today will be the first full day of the new administration, the Biden-Harris administration. And we certainly know that the whole world is watching after the last 14 days here in Washington. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful editor, Ryan, who will introduce our two panelists who certainly don't need an introduction. There'll be some back and forth, and then we're very eager to take everyone's questions as time allows. We'll wrap up in about 55, 60 minutes. So Ryan.
So welcome everybody. We are very lucky to have two of the foremost experts on the Balkans join us today for a very timely discussion on the transatlantic relationship and the Balkans. So as Ari alluded to, the events of order today will be introductions, then I'll pass the floor to Florian and then Ed Joseph, followed by a Q&A. If you do have questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A box. So Florian is a professor of Southeast European History and Politics, director of the Center for Southeastern European Studies, and the Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Graz in Austria. In addition, he is the coordinator of the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group and president of the Association of the Study of Nationalities. He is a frequent political commenter and has written numerous books, including his two most recent ones published just last year, including Debating Nationalism, The Global Spread of Nations, and the Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans. He previously worked at the European Center for Minority Issues in Belgrade and in Sarajevo, taught at the University of Kent and Cornell University, and was a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and New York University. We are very happy to have Florian join us today. And on the other side of the Atlantic, we are joined by Edward Joseph, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS University, conflict management, where he's a senior fellow with the Center for Transatlantic Relations. Ed has several dozen years of experience in the Balkans, including on the ground throughout the war years in all conflicted area zones. In July 1995, contemporaneous with the Srebrenica genocide, Ed and one UN colleague coordinated the evacuation of the neighboring Žepa enclave. He also testified twice before the Hague Tribunal as a fact witness in war crimes trials. After the Dayton Agreement, Ed served on active duty with the US Army and the NATO I-4 Implementation Force. In 2012, Ed was recognized by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for his role in negotiating an 11th hour deal over elections between Belgrade and Pristina. Ed has also served on missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Haiti, and currently works on Libya. His commentary has appeared in Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and other major outlets. So, Florian, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Sari, for the invitation. It's great to be having this conversation. It's also great to be discussing this in a certain way, you know, amidst the gloom of the last year, with a prospect of maybe improved transatlantic cooperation when it comes to the Western Balkans. And so let me just give you a few pointers, and we can gladly discuss them later on. So, I mean, this is, of course, in any change of administration, there's always an opportunity to reflect and change on issues such as transatlantic cooperation. Of the potential of change coming after January 20th. I mean, I think it's an understatement to say that the transatlantic relations have been not ideal in the last 4 years. And they've been, in fact, the way the dynamics has been going has been highly disruptive when it comes to the Western Balkans. I mean, a pillar of the peace order of the region has been resting on the premise of a strong cooperation between the United States and the European Union. Now, some of the vestiges of that cooperation survived the Trump years, and I think diplomats like Matthew Palmer are to be thanked for that, to keep that dialogue and that conversation open. And there have been some notable successes, such as making sure that Montenegro joined NATO, and then more importantly, the NATO membership for North Macedonia, which was a very important step, not just for the country, but also for showing that disputes can be resolved, including the longstanding dispute between Greece and North Macedonia. So the last 4 years aren't all bad news, but there are plenty of shortcomings. Just one is the parallel Serbia-Kosovo dialogue between one mediated by Richard Grenell in the United States, and another one paralleled by the European Union under the leadership of Miroslav Lajčák over the last year. There hasn't been the kind of backing up of the US on the European integration front. And there's been lots of mixed messages. And I think we see that the Euro-Atlantic kind of cooperation works best when there's a unified message. Of course, the US and the European Union, and in fact, the EU itself, often have, over the last decades, had different priorities and different approaches, but the fundamental messages were the similar ones. It's about the future of the region is in Euro-Atlantic integration, and it's about multilateral, close cooperation. And that offer and that, in a certain way, package was questioned in the last 4 years. So this is why it matters that there is going to be a new opportunity for renewing that basic premise of the future for the region. So I think that's very important. Now, 2 points I want to make. One is about the specific issues where one could focus on, and the second one is about how to approach it. So of course, there are lots of open, there are lots of building sites in the region. And some of them are the responsibility of the European Union. So I want to be very clear. I don't want to say that the main responsibility why things haven't been progressing well in the Western Balkans is only one president or an administration, but it's a breakdown also in the European Union of tackling the challenges of the region effectively. And some of it is the similar kind of democratic challenges within the European Union, just like in the United States, which have preoccupied both actors in the region, but also have undermined them as role models. I mean, this is, both the US and the European Union were the prime role models for the Western Balkans. The EU has struggled with Hungary and Poland, and the US had its sort of internal democratic struggles. Both undermine the message of both the US and the EU being these, clear, not just partners and not just in a certain way structures, networks in which to integrate in, but also this kind of sense that they are, in a certain way, showing of how democracies are resilient and functional. Now, this can be restored, and this is, I think, a task at hand. But what are the challenges? I mean, first of all, when it comes to enlargement, which is the big political project for the region, enlargement is in deep crisis in the Western Balkans. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the German, most important German conservative daily, published an article a few days ago saying enlargement is dead. Now, and this is not the first voice to state that. It's maybe the most prominent one in recent weeks. I wouldn't agree with that assessment, or in a certain way with more the kind of pessimism implied with it. But it's in very profound crisis, and they hope that it just continues, just with a little bit of tinkering here and there is not realistic. So this is something where transatlantic cooperation can come in and help, because it seems like the EU by itself is unable to complete its own enlargement without the friendly and constructive support of its US allies. Then there are a couple of issues in the region which are unresolved. The Serbia-Kosovo dialogue is the obvious one to mention. There's been no progress. There's been dialogue for 10 years now, and no end in sight, no prospect of actually having Serbia recognize Kosovo and unlocking this open question. And the other one, which I should mention, is of course Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Ed is very much familiar with through his work, and I'd be curious to hear his views. The fact that the country is in a crisis politically is not able to have the internal dynamics to really change the way it's governed as a cohesive country, is one of the big problems and one of the big failures. And this has been discussed in the anniversary of Dayton, that despite all the gratefulness for ending the war, Dayton is an unfinished project because it's still in force and still acting as a peace agreement and not as a functional country. This is one of the big questions which I think will come on the agenda of transatlantic cooperation. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of democratic backsliding in the region, the fact that the countries are less democratic for the most part than they were 10 years ago in particular. The big problem there is Serbia, which is by far the largest country, and it's hard to imagine resolving the big issues of the region without a democratic Serbia. And Serbia is nowadays further away from a democracy than any point since 2000, the fall of the Milosevic government. And this is a real challenge. So to conclude is, this is a great opportunity, but we should not think of this as being just returning to the Obama years. I mean, and I'm saying this with the full appreciation of the Obama administration, but I'm saying that the problems the region are facing will not be resolved by just returning to the very positive, constructive atmosphere the US and the EU had back then, but thinking that that is enough to change the dynamics in the region. There's been 4 years and longer of democratic backsliding in the region. There's been a strong rise of alternative political actors, be it China and Russia, who've been not that much autonomously, but rather with the help of local elites coming in and being quite effective. And there's the weakness of the EU enlargement project. So there are a couple of these challenges which are not just going to be resolved by returning to business as usual, as it might have been the case before 2016. So I think one needs to develop new strategies, joint strategies. And I'm not going to offer a solution because this is it's too complicated and probably requires a lot of individual tinkering, but it requires a strategic commitment of both sides to work together and come up with specific strategies. And that means playing to each side's strength. Enlargement and the integration of the European Union remains the main game in town for the region. But that can only work when there is a bit of banging heads together and a little bit of kind of undiplomatic or diplomatic forcefulness the US is much better at than Brussels is. But this should be not ad hoc, but this should be strategic. Now, nobody's expecting the US administration to take a big interest in the Western Balkans. I would be very surprised considering all the other issues at stake around the world. But I think a little bit of strategic interest and commitment in conjunction with the European Union can go a long way, even if it is, of course, has many other places to focus on. So I think there, of course, the ball is mostly in the Europeans' court. I mean, there we have to fix the most to make this process functional again. But with a slight gentle push and an open ear by the right people in the next administration, I think a lot can be achieved. But again, I'm not trying to say there's a single answer of how to do this, but it might be first trying to, I don't believe that, for example, the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue is resolvable in a positive outcome anytime soon. So this would be not my strategic advice of investing energy into that at this moment, not because I wouldn't like it to see be resolved, but because I believe with a undemocratic Serbian government, which has shown no willingness to genuinely resolve this issue and has very few incentives, in fact, at the moment, I don't expect there to be a resolution of that particular dispute. So it might be worth focusing on others to, in a certain way, create a positive dynamic in the region, going for the lower hanging fruits, which show that renewed Euro-Atlantic, transatlantic cooperation can really deliver. Might be a few small successes in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It might be really encouraging more democratic voices across the region. It might be focusing on issues such as dealing with the past. And I mean, this is one of the things which I think maybe is the last point I should mention, is besides democratic backsliding, the fact that the rhetoric, the discourse in the region is so, in a certain way, focused on the wars of the 90s and nationalist exclusive narratives as if there'd been not 25 years since then, is, I think, tremendously detrimental. And we see this over and over again, even when younger politicians come to power, like we saw in Banja Luka with the new mayor being elected recently, whose first statements was that he was not going to recognize the ICTY judgments against Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, that Srebrenica was not a genocide, that Banja Luka should be a Cyrillic city, I mean, whatever that means. All of this, this is a 27-year-old man who was born 2 years before Dayton, and it was seen as a kind of alternative to the old elites. this is a problem. This is, I think, not a problem of one person, but this is a structural regional problem. And there, some initiatives from the US and the EU together might be able to at least help to change the messages. So I think there are plenty of places, plenty of opportunities to work. It might not be the best to deal with the hardest ones first, but again, strategic commitment, pushing in the right direction, coordination, I think will go a long way in making a change after January 20th in the region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Florian. I think that was a very unique perspective on it, particularly coming from the European side of the Atlantic. With that, let's turn it over to Ed.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Pleasure to be with you. And Florian, always an honor to get your views and learn from the European perspective. And before I begin, let me quickly thank Ryan and Ari and congratulate them for the great work that they do, really just in keeping all those who are interested in the Balkans expertly informed throughout the year. I wanted to take that opportunity and acknowledge, Ryan, your great work and Ari's great work. Florian, I think you set this up perfectly for me because in order for the US and Europe to work together, we have to be candid and not just simply think that we can revert to some business that was the norm before Trump. And so you've set me up perfectly for that. I think it would be unusual for me to begin, though, without mentioning this searing event, even a crisis that we've been through in the US this past week with this insurrection at the Capitol. And I don't want to delve into it from the American perspective here, except to say that I think it's far more than simply a momentary event. This is in some ways a shattering event. And it has relevance for the work that we do in the Balkans, because it raises the question, are we serious when we say that we want democracy? And now we have the challenge here. We see all the pretense has been ripped away. And we see that in our own countries, we have very serious work to do. And the question is, with respect to the Balkans, are we serious about that same work in the Balkans as well? Or are we willing to make the same compromises that we've made in the past when it comes to that? So that's the challenge. I would mention, I have a piece out on foreign policy just out today that addresses some of these questions and about whether the US can still lead on democracy promotion in the world. So Florian, to address your question, let's take the basic point here that everyone seems to say, which is after the Trump administration, the acrimony, the contempt shown for Europe by the Trump administration, the US and Europe should work together on all issues, but particularly in the Balkans. That's sort of the standard line when we approach this topic. Well, there's one problem with that. If you look closer at the Trump administration, in fact, the most serious mistake it made, the most serious mistake made in the Balkans in many years was the product of close transatlantic cooperation. That was the land swap over Kosovo. So, which in some ways that people think, well, that's finished and the Washington and Brussels have repudiated that. Well, that's not really the case, because the land swap mentality, the mentality that gave us the land swap, is still present. And that's among the challenges that we have to think about. So the lesson from that first is that transatlantic cooperation in and of itself doesn't necessarily give good policy solutions, because there was very close cooperation, and it was not just at the White House there. That cooperation, the land swap, extended beyond that. There was close support for that, for what Brussels was attempting to do. So what are we going to do with this transatlantic relationship? How are we going to approach the Balkans? Well, I would say we have to be, Florian, to take your approach, we have to be candid with each other. We have to be candid about the differences in the way we approach this region. I think that's the fundamental. If we're not candid, if we just proceed from something, oh, we have shared interests, let's cooperate. It's a recipe for frustration and lack of success. So let's take a look at the differences, some of the key differences, not all of them, between the US and Europe. Let's start at the top, the biggest global one. We have the statement from one of the clearest statements about transatlantic security from President Macron last year, saying there should be an independent European security capacity so that Europe can play a significant role on the world stage. And my diplomatic answer to President Macron would be this. President Macron, that's great that you want to play this grand role on the world stage. Could you begin in the Balkans? And that's really, it's the point here, that in France, it's seen that Europe is supposed to play this grand role, and yet it doesn't remember that the Balkans are part of Europe and are fragmented and deteriorating. So we see the first problem in transatlantic relations is this myopia there. And if you think about it, what is underneath the myopia? Because no one in Europe really caught that irony. The arguments in Germany and Spain and others against France were, well, we don't want to lose the American pillar. But no one brought up that irony that, gee, we can't even deal with Kosovo and Bosnia and North Macedonia. And look what's happening in Montenegro. How can we have ambitions for the rest of the world? No one really thought about that, but we think about that. That's one of the differences here. And if you think about what's underneath that myopia, I'd say it's a couple of things. I'd say first, and this is the most serious one, complacency. There's a belief in Europe that everything is okay in the Balkans. Yeah, you know, they have their problems and this, but with the EU accession and the processes that we have in place, it's okay. So that's one of the key differences there, is there's simply a complacency. And because there's a complacency, there's an unwillingness to take and to take the measures and work with the US on the measures, and it's crucial to work together on those measures that would address these problems there. So that's number one. The second, of course, Florian, you alluded to it, is the whole premise or the cornerstone of Western strategy is EU accession, NATO and then EU accession. Well, you just indicated it. What good is your strategy if the EU is not serious about enlargement? You have a proposition that EU accession is the solution, and yet there's no serious about that. And we see that that's not just a problem in Europe, that's a problem in the Balkans, because there's declining faith in the EU, in joining the EU, in integration in the EU among the people. You see that in surveys. And so there's an increasing irrelevance to this strategy that we've concocted. And again, there's not much seriousness about this in Europe. So I think that that's the first point. We have to come together that there's serious problems here, and there are. If Bosnia and Kosovo continue like this, and Florian, you were saying, well, gee, you know, there's no prospect for addressing Kosovo. Well, if they continue in this state, it's not good. This is not healthy. This does not end up well. And this is 25 years on in the case of Bosnia and 2 decades in the case of Kosovo. And this does not end up well. And you mentioned the threat from Russia and China. Are we serious about that, or is that just lip service? Because if we're serious about that threat, well, then we can't just let these problems fester. We have to address them. So that's the first element here. The second element of EU-US differences is in just the inability of the EU to overcome its divisions on some of these things. And some of them are so obvious, they've been internalized. They've become, I would use the word,
it looks like we lost Ed there for a second. Let me try and get in touch with him real quick. In the meantime, before we get him back, I will propose the first question as questions keep coming in. Florian, you talked a lot about EU enlargement. Now, we've seen that there are plenty of issues within the EU itself, whether it be the Netherlands and previously France blocking Albania from formally opening EU accession talks, to now North Macedonia facing a lot of blockage from neighboring Bulgaria over the name issue and historical figures. So I was wondering what can be done within the EU itself to convince individual member states to push forward with EU enlargement.
Thanks, Ryan, for the question. And I mean, just to put that in context with what Ed was saying, I think one of the problems is that the EU's policy towards the Western Balkans has been exclusively enlargement. And of course, if your only policy is enlargement and no foreign policy otherwise, or it's very weak foreign policy, then of course you're losing tools with that one tool is blocked. And this is exactly what you're alluding to. We've seen multiple blockages. I mean, France and the Netherlands regarding Macedonia and Albania, subsequently the problem now with Bulgaria. And if Bulgaria might concede, and again, we don't have any guarantees for that, then of course there might be another country. I mean, Estonia or Malta or any individual country can, for whatever reason, block the process. Now, to answer your question, there are two approaches. There's the one approach is how to deal with this, the symptoms, and the other one is how to deal with the causes. Ed is back, so I would let him finish, and then I'll give you the answer to the question you've asked.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm attributing that to my mention of Russia and intervention there, but fortunately, I have SolarWinds as my security provider, so I'm sure I'll be okay now, but thank you. I apologize for that. But to come to the next point, and then I'll close to it and we'll open it up for the comments, and I'm very eager to hear Florian's response. But the second point is the divisions within Europe. And what I was saying is that some of them are so obvious and long-standing that they've become normalized. People just simply accept them. For example, Serbia and Kosovo, we have to understand that the only reason that Kosovo is unresolved is because of the 5 non-recognizers. In fact, if only 4 of them would recognize Kosovo, the problem would be over because it wouldn't matter what Serbia's position is. Serbia's position would be irrelevant. But we forget that, and that's totally within the hands of Europe to address. So that's one example of those divisions. The other, of course, look at North Macedonia. We have that long postponed opening of EU accessions, and now it's blocked by Bulgaria, which tells us a couple of things. It tells us that the whole theory that the solution to this region is EU accession, that whole theory, look, Bulgaria is a full EU member, and its actions are every bit those of what we see from the parties in the region who are not EU members. And then the other thing we should remember is that North Macedonia's postponement, this isn't the first time. The second time it wasn't a Balkan, the first time it was not a Balkan nation. It was France that postponed North Macedonia's EU accession after the Prespa Agreement in 2019. So again, we have these divisions and this lack of seriousness. Then the third thing I'd point out, again, you typically overlooked, is we have the policy of enlargement, at least nominally. Well, in its wisdom, who did the EU entrust to lead the enlargement process? A Hungarian. And again, these things, we're all used to this. Everyone knows the name Oliver Varhelyi and so forth. But we have to stop and think. It's absurd. If you tried ahead of time and said, the criterion for the country, the nationality of the person who leads the EU enlargement process, it should be the worst possible example for the countries of the Balkans. If that was the criterion, you would end up with Hungary. It's the worst possible example. And I'll just underscore it with an analogy. Here in the US would be in the Americas, for example, if the Organization of American States would put Cuba in charge of human rights. It's absurd. And yet it's done, and then people say, well, you know, that's European politics, EPP, and this internal structures, and as if these are valid excuses, but they're not. And again, I refer to my main point, which is all these internal political things, all they are reminders that in fact for Europe, the Balkans are just not that important. Because if they were, these political issues wouldn't be the controlling factors. Other factors would be controlling. And finally, I'll close because I mentioned at the beginning about the land swap. And what I said about the mentality of the land swap. And this is transatlantic, Florence. So here I'm gonna not, you know, beat up on Europe here. This is totally shared problem of mentality. We have to ask ourselves, what was behind the land swap? What were these people thinking? Why would they put at risk the fundamental security principle that we don't want more changes of borders, we don't want changes of borders and exchanges of population? Why would they put that at risk? What would prompt them to do this besides the fact that, oh, well, it's consensual and therefore we'll control it, which of course is a highly problematic and in my view, completely incorrect assumption. Well, why would they do this? For me, the answer is clear. Because they saw no alternative. The diplomats who agreed to this, and again, this is a broad section of diplomats. This is not just John Bolton and Federica Mogherini. These are others. This is in the bureaucracies of Washington and Brussels as well. We're active collaborators in this effort. And in my view, the primary motivating factor is, well, we have no alternative. We have no leverage over Alexander Vučić, so we will give him what he wants, which is territory. And what is the danger in that? When you do that, you not only are creating this terrible precedent and a hugely problematic solution, but you're communicating to Alexander Vučić that we agree with you, that you hold the leverage and we don't. And then you say, well, why am I talking about the land swap? That's finished, because the mentality, the same mentality persists. And Florian, again, I say this is transatlantic. The same mentality that gave us the land swap persists. Do we challenge Alexander Vučić on his democracy, on this slide on autocracy? Do we say anything about that? Do you hear anything about that from the US side or from significant factors in Europe other than a few MEPs who mention it? You hear very little. To the contrary, these are the messages that we give the US. Here, Florian, I'm being equal balanced here, so I'm not just going after Europe. This is what we hear from the US side. What was the most crucial event in Serbia's democracy last year? Elections. They held elections. And the vast part of the opposition boycotted those elections. They boycotted because they said, look, there's absolutely no landscape here. There's no democratic landscape. This is a farce, these elections. What did the US say about this? Did the US do perhaps as it might have done and just stay silent and let them make their own decision? No. The US effectively backed the government and said, no, you should participate in the elections. And in so doing, in a way, suggested that the boycott was illegitimate. And we know now the boycott was actually quite successful because it succeeded in delegitimizing this massive, quote, victory that Alexander Vučić won. And then this same mentality of, I wrote a piece and called it the see no evil approach, this reluctance to take on some of the reprehensible remarks of senior Serbian officials. I'm not saying you have to criticize every day, every minute, but some of these remarks are so inflammatory, so beyond the pale, and to stay silent on them is in a way, well, I would just say it's quite counterproductive. And then not only is there silence, we hear affirmative support for the Serbian government. In the wake of the Biden election victory, we've heard affirmative praise of the Serbian government. Our quote, that Serbia is an exporter of security. These are the type of phrases that we've heard. And this, in my view, I call this the land swap mentality. This is the mentality that says we have no leverage. We don't dare say anything. We can only talk about Operation Halyard in World War II and flying the Serbian flag over the White House in World War I, which is great. Those are great things. It's great to talk about Serbian-American friendship. Nothing wrong with that. But not only that. And here, Ryan and Ari and Florian, I close with a reference that I opened to our own challenge in democracy that we saw at the US Capitol this week. Are we serious? Are we serious about this stuff? Are we only serious maybe, when there's, these graphic insurrection and so forth? Are we serious at home? Let's hope we're serious at home about the weaknesses in our own democracy. Like, this certainly should be as if we needed another wake-up call, this should certainly be it. But are we also serious about that in the Balkans? And I close there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ed. While we lost you for a second, you read our minds because we started discussing enlargement fatigue with Albania as well as North Macedonia and the internal EU divisions. So we'll continue with that, Florian. And also we have a really good question that comes from Chris Dolan, which plays up on this, which is, to what extent is accession fatigue within the Western Balkan nations a factor in contributing to the backsliding democracy taking place? Let's remember last year that the Washington-based watchdog Freedom House downgraded both Montenegro and Serbia to hybrid regimes. So keeping that in mind, the US over here recognizes it. And how does that also play into the European perspectives?
So thanks, Ryan. And I mean, I want to echo what Ed said. I mean, I fully agree with your analysis. And I think, it's not about, I think those of us who are critical about, this kind of less, not taking the region seriously and not developing serious responses, I think we agree transatlantic on these. And, I'm quite happy to see also your critical remarks about the European Union. I would agree with, the vast majority of them. And I think what we have is first, to answer maybe Ryan's earlier question, what can be done about the blockages about enlargement, which is, Ed, you also alluded to, and I fully subscribe to that. Now, one is, of course, on an ad hoc basis, is put pressure on individual countries who block it. And this might not work for France. The Commission bent over backwards to accommodate France with this new methodology, in fact, which is not that bad when you look at the substance of it. It's just what caused it was not a good reason. But it's actually striking, and I think this is that a country like Bulgaria, which I think a few years ago would have not dared to go against the majority of the European Union on an issue like that, did so, despite it obviously having some political cost, but it felt it was not that high anymore, that it wasn't going to get enough backlash in the European Union. But there basically one needs a clear message from key EU member states to say this is unacceptable. And that's also where the US can help and can say, well, listen, send a clear message to Bulgaria saying this is, you're a fellow NATO member state with North Macedonia. You cannot behave like that. It's irresponsible. So their clear messages would help. Strategically, in the long run, the EU has to change the rules. It cannot allow individual member states to block accession process. At the end of the day, it still has to be ratified by all 27, but it shouldn't be that every single step can be blocked all along by Malta, Bulgaria. I mean, I'm just saying Malta because it's a small country. It could be any country which blocks it, and that's really absurd. But on the question of which Ryan, you brought up from Chris, I think that's it's of course the accession fatigue is based on the fact that, first of all, nobody in the EU is talking openly in the region saying, listen, Alexander Vučić is not behaving democratically. Nobody's saying that, even though it's a precondition for joining the European Union. You cannot bring a dictator or an authoritarian regime into the European Union at its helm. You have to wait until you're in, and only then you can become authoritarian. I mean, I'm being facetious, but this is unfortunately the reality. But the problem is, of course, the EU needs to find a remedy to deal with the authoritarians in its own midst. to make sure that you're not going to get more Orbans. And in fact, I mean, while I disagree with Macron's blockage of North Macedonia and Albania, he is fundamentally right about saying that until we have a mechanism in the EU to deal with serious democratic backsliding within the EU, we shouldn't let countries in where this is not resolved or where there's a risk. And of course, all of the countries of the Western Balkans, there's a risk in any country in the world. We see it in the US, we see it in many other countries. So you cannot assume that in the accession process, you're going to be safe for the rest of your life from backsliding. So you have to have a tool within the European Union. Now, I would always argue these tools can be developed in parallel with the accession process. Nobody is going to think that Serbia and Montenegro are going to join in the next 3, 4, 5 years. But these tools need to be developed actually for the process to be credible, because then also those who are skeptic in the European Union about enlargement can say, well, listen, we have a tool now to penalize those who are actually backsliding in democracy within the European Union. So we can let countries in more easily because we have tools what to do afterwards. And that's what the EU is lacking. So this is where really a lot of energy should be invested in my mind.
Ed, feel free to add anything.
Well, Florian, I appreciate those remarks. And of course, what you say is right. And the concern that Europe has about bringing about more Orbans is right. The question is, okay, what's the way to do that? Do you do that by this postponement of North Macedonia, which is not an authoritarian government? There's not. It's a reformist government. This was, Zoran Zaev took these heroic steps to conclude this agreement with Greece, which also took very difficult steps there. And you immediately turn and make North Macedonia the sacrifice for these concerns. I mean, that's one point. So there's a certain lack of logic there. The second point is, Florian, is that Macron won these reforms. He won these reforms. They took months. They reviewed the whole EU accession process. They instituted this upfront focus on rule of law. Okay, you've got it now. You have what you want. Now you should, and this is what I believe the US posture should be. Our posture is, okay, you have what you want. Now commit to it. Commit to the enlargement process. It's sort of terrible that the Frankfurter Allgemeine, if that was the paper, just wrote this. I mean, what was the point of this exercise about all of this rule of law stuff? This was just a charade. So, I mean, this is just at the last EU summit back, or the one prior in Zagreb, when it was, all of that was formalized. So it's really quite puzzling. Let me share one other thing. Florian, I'll get your take on this, that there's something else going on here that I think where there's a transatlantic difference, fundamental one, is there's a question of whether in Europe, capitals, let's say most of capitals, if not among the population, about whether or how much they see the citizens of the Balkans as European. And this is important difference because we do. I believe we do. I believe fundamentally a guy like Joe Biden does in his bones and would not have been as active on these matters in the 1990s if he hadn't. And I think that carries across the US government and people who work on this region, is we really believe this stuff. We really believe in the EU integration of the Balkans. We believe, as President-elect Biden recently said, that in reference to the Dayton Agreement, the 25th anniversary Dayton Agreement, that Bosnia is in the heart of Europe. The Balkans are in the heart of Europe. We believe that. In the US. I don't believe that that's really the bedrock conviction in Europe. And Florian, I would say this, it's not just me saying this. So this isn't just some American, who worked in the Balkans opining. I spoke recently to the leader of one of the countries of the Balkans, who had just prior to that met with a very prominent European leader. And I'm going to share with you what the perception of that Balkans leader was after this meeting with this European leader. His perception was that this Balkans leader basically sees, this European leader basically sees the Balkans as a buffer zone to migrants from Europe. So that's not my impression. That's not me saying this as some critic from the US. That's the view of one of the leaders of the countries in the Balkans. And if that's their perception, it's a problem. And again, I see a lot of it's reflected in surveys of public opinion about declining support for EU membership. And again, these are serious problems. And the question for someone, any European leader, but particularly Macron, who has these ambitions and aspirations, do you see the risk to European security if these situations, if this continues like this, if this stasis in Bosnia continues like this? And don't you see the risks for this, for Europe? You believe that this is a stable outcome for Europe? And that's, again, until there's that fundamental shakeup from the complacency, how do we get to effective policy? Florian, I'll get your views on this, the name of this German individual who supposedly Berlin wants to send to Bosnia as a high representative. Well, who just endorsed him? Christian Schwarz-Schilling, the former high representative who, more than any other international, is responsible for the utter paralysis that Bosnia is in today. Now, I don't know much about this individual who's been nominated. There's been a lot of criticism in Sarajevo and concern, relationship with Russia and so forth. But does it reflect seriousness? I'm not sure. Please.
I mean, first of all, to your observation, I mean, there are plenty of xenophobic and narrow-minded Europeans, both leaders and electorate. I mean, just like in the United States, right? And so that reflects itself also in their attitudes towards the Balkans. I mean, I don't think that's a general attitude that exists. I mean, it's undeniable. It's the far-right political parties in Europe. It's some other mainstream leaders as well who are quite hostile. And I think they're different. There are those who kind of look negatively at the Balkans. There are those who don't care, and there are plenty though who do care. And I mean, it's just like in the United States. It's a complex environment where people have different attitudes. I think there are plenty of leaders and there are plenty of citizens who believe it. I mean, Austria is one of the most skeptical countries about enlargement. But if you look down at the data, which country would Austrians be most happy to accept into the European Union? It's Bosnia. And why is it Bosnia? And this, I think, debunks also the myth that there's something about kind of some Islamophobia in general. I mean, yes, there are people who are hostile toward majority Muslim countries, but in Austria, which has quite a lot of, that hostility and far right, people would first think of Bosnia to join the European before Serbia, before Montenegro, before anybody else. Why? Because there are many Bosnians in Austria, and it's actually a positive story. We have Alma Zajdic, who is the Minister of Justice of Austria, who is of Bosnian origin. And so Bosnians are quite prominent in public life in Austria, I mean, Austrians of Bosnian descent. So these things are changing. And I think we have in many countries these significant populations who are quite supportive and who have ties, who know the Balkans. So I don't think it's only this kind of xenophobia is prevailing. It's a lot of this kind of general skepticism. And then the problem is, unlike the Balkans is for the US foreign policy and nothing else. For the EU, it's both foreign policy and domestic policy. When it comes to Bulgaria, it's domestic politics. When it comes to Croatia, it's domestic politics and foreign politics. When it comes to even other countries, even in France, it's also domestic politics. I mean, the reason why Macron was against Albania and North Macedonia is because there's plenty of anti-Albanian stereotypes in France, which I've encountered talking to MPs when that decision was taken. So the problem is, it's not just foreign policy where you can think strategically what is the best interest, but a lot of people get interested in many EU countries about enlargement because it's not just about resolving a situation in a region far away, but it's something which many people, for the right or the wrong reasons, consider affecting them directly. And that sometimes creates this linkage, which makes it sometimes harder to move because, again, we have these alliances of political parties, you have all of these linkages. I mean, in a certain way, the Western Balkans is already fully integrated into Europe, and that sometimes makes it harder to move forward than on a faraway place where, you know, in the Sahel, France can pretty much decide what it wants for EU foreign policy, and the rest will probably follow. But when it comes to the Western Balkans, it's too close for comfort in a certain way to have a clear European policy line on all of that. And that's unfortunate. I mean, I'd be the first one to argue that it should have. And I think some of the steps are not entirely serious, not communicated well, what you've mentioned. But I think there's a structural difficulty there, which is very hard to overcome. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't try. I don't think there's been enough effort made, but I think these are that there's a structural difference between the EU and the US engagement, which the EU structurally cannot overcome fully because of the nature of the beast.
Florian, Ryan, is it okay? Can I respond to Florian?
Yes, and I'm going to add one more question onto that when you're finished, if there's time.
Of course.
Which I think is a very important question that we should delve into.
I think Florian makes great points. And what you just said, Florian, about that for the US, it's foreign policy, and for Europe, it's domestic and foreign policy. And for that reason is more complicated. I think that is really a quite important fundamental insight. And there's then a conclusion we should draw from that, which is, for that very reason, the EU cannot ipso facto be the leader on the Balkans. And just in and of itself, I'm not saying there aren't areas or cases or examples where it can, but the notion that, well, the Balkans are in Europe and we're European, we're the EU, so we should lead, for the very reason you just mentioned, for the very reason this complicated mix, the fact that you have these complicating political relationships that is part of domestic politics, and we don't have those, that means in many cases it should be discussed about who should be the leader. And so, for example, in the EU, the quote EU-led dialogue, which is how it's always termed in Brussels, the EU-led dialogue, and that this should be automatic deference to the EU. Is that wise? There, I'm not, trying to get in. There's nothing about my friend Miroslav Lajčák here, who's extremely capable, one of the most experienced people on the Balkans there is. But it's not about that. It's about these fundamental concerns. Let me, as I mentioned, Lajčák, I'm going to give you one concrete example of this, Florian, and this where you see this myopia about the problem. There was a couple months ago a new Slovak ambassador appointed to Belgrade. What did he say? This new Slovak ambassador, and Slovakia, one of the 5 EU non-recognizers, and there a former Slovak foreign minister, Miroslav Lajčák, is the special envoy. So what did this Slovak ambassador say? What was one of the first things he said as he arrived in Belgrade? A big announcement to, again, type of land swap mentality, to ingratiate himself with Alexander Vučić. You know what he said? You don't need to recognize Kosovo. You don't need to. That's not what we're after. You don't need to recognize Kosovo. And what should his message have been if there was seriousness in this? His message should have been the opposite. His message should have been, look, we're carrying your water on not recognizing Kosovo. We're doing your work for you. We have our former foreign minister trying to negotiate a deal. You should be serious, Mr. Vučić. You should knock off this inflammatory comments that are only charging the atmosphere and showing your unreadiness. You should be serious, Mr. Vučić, because we are. And that, Florian, you see, that doesn't cost very much to do that. But instead we have the opposite. And as long as we have that from one of the non-recognizers, whose former foreign minister is the guy leading EU policy, trying to get a deal, are we going to get very far? Please.
So that's a great segue into what just happened this past week. While Secretary of State Pompeo had canceled his trip to Europe, we saw that Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Phil Rieker, actually meet with Miroslav Lajčák, and they discussed renewed cooperation. Lajczak was also on a webinar with German ambassador to the United States, Haber, and he spoke about how the Washington Agreement moved Kosovo and Serbia away from the EU. Looking forward to 2021 and even further down the line, what can we expect with this Washington Agreement? Remembering there are two documents unilaterally signed by each country, which I still don't think there's a clear answer whether these are simply pledges or this is a signed binding agreement. So I think it would be great to get both the European and American take on this issue. And then we'll wrap up.
So, I mean, I would say that, and I mean, Ed was already alluding to it to some degree, and I subscribe that the current format of dialogue is not going to yield any results. And part of it is structural in the sense that the EU as an organization, again, we're talking about the EU as an organization, cannot really, doesn't have much leverage over the 5 non-recognizers. And of course, this is the big issue. I mean, it's like, what you actually need is normalization to allow Kosovo to be recognized by the 5 non-recognizers and to make further steps in terms of international membership. I mean, for this is what really matters. I mean, I would always say, for Kosovo, if it only gets Serbian normalization with Serbia, whatever it looks like, without the 5 non-recognizers recognizing Kosovo, then nothing is achieved because nothing is unlocked. It's really what Kosovo should look out for is, what matters is visa liberalization, which is long overdue, and the other issue, which is moving, having a pathway towards membership in international organizations, whether it's NATO, whether it's Council of Europe, and of course EU at the end of the day as well, and UN. And so there, you need a whole new framework. You need a new concept of dialogue, which should be US-EU joint dialogue in my book, not separate. And I don't think of the Washington Agreement there will be anything left besides maybe a few reminders, and I think they're not going to be really that relevant. I mean, the economic side is important, but economics is not going to normalize relations. I mean, Greece and North Macedonia had 20 years of good economic relations, and it didn't resolve the issue. You can have perfect normal economic relations and nothing happens on the political front. So there needs to be a serious commitment of both sides, and also a clear definition is, and I think that I agree with you, Ed, is about what you need to define is what is the reward if you agree. I mean, what is the incentive? But what is the limit? What is the what you don't offer? And I think they are the kind of saying, well, you can be authoritarian, you can talk about border swaps, you can insult the others. No, this is not part of the deal. So it has to be very clear to me that the agreement needs to entail de-escalation, changing of the message, confidence building between the two countries, and it has to be very clear what is the end goal and what is the process to lead to it. And if the EU and the US are clearer about this and joined in this approach, both in the incentives, but also, and the EU is terrible with punishment. I mean, it's just, but it has to also think about what are the penalties if you're obstructing the process, if you're sending, iconic trains to be, and make other gestures, which, I mean, I read Serbian tabloids, and, every day, and they're all controlled by the regime. They, they constantly spew out hate every single day. The ministers insult Albanians every single day. I mean, this is just not, this is where I would agree with you, Ed, that we need a clear message that this is unacceptable, and that there is a process which also, tells them it's not just about meeting in Brussels once a month, but it's about having a serious, sustained process, which includes track 2 diplomacy, confidence building measures, the whole package. And if one party is failing it, then it will be pointed out that it's failing it. And there's there has to be a clear set of rewards, benefits, and costs if you don't partake in all of that. And unless we do that, I don't think the process is going to lead anywhere, at least not with the current Serbian administration, which I'm in general skeptical about that it has any interest or any motivation to conclude a genuine agreement of normalization with Kosovo.
Ryan, can I respond here to Florian?
Yes, of course. We want to hear the American view of all of this as well.
Yeah,
from the
great.
US.
And I really appreciate what Florian is saying. And let me try to address directly some of the points that he raised in your question, Ryan, which is what about this Washington Agreement? And what did that do? Okay, So just to simplify this, it's had more than this, but there's two main effects of the Washington Agreement. One was negative and one is potentially positive. The negative one is it relieved pressure on the intransigent party, which is Belgrade, which is President Vučić. So that's what it did. It wasn't some precursor to, oh, gee, this breakthrough that's going to come right around the corner. No. And Grinnell even said that. Grinnell even said, first, they have to achieve economic normalization, and only then can they have their political agreement. So there wasn't even the vision of this thing to actually resolve this. And that was great if you're Alexander Vučić, because his main strategy is just to protract the process. And this was great, a great opportunity. He looks like a collaborative guy, and he gets pressure off of him. So that's the negative political side. Potentially positive is, and we should say this and not say, oh, gee, just because it was the previous administration did it, that it's all terrible. Some of these economic components have people excited. So there's, this opening of the DFC office in Belgrade, potential for this small, medium enterprise, potential for economic cooperation. These are good things. These are positive. It's not to be all completely dismissed and thrown out the window. So those are some positive things, but Florian is right. These are not transformative. And I agree with Florian, I've written about it. The case of Greece is the proof of it where Greece for 2 decades acted against its financial interest, economic interest in North Macedonia, where it is one of the main investors by continuing isolating the country, keeping it out of the European Union and NATO. It directly hurt the valuations of in Okta and the banks that it holds ownership interests in. And so it's been proven these things are not, and plus they take a long time. The economic processes, which are positive generally, although sometimes there are some negatives to them, they take some time. So that's the main thing. Then, so what do you do about it? Here, Florian, there's 2 things just in close, because there are 2 elements about this. You pointed out about the non-recognizers. What I've written, this was in a piece in Foreign Policy in September, is that the way to go about this is actually get the 4 non-recognizers, 4 of them. You don't need Cyprus. The 4 who are members of NATO, and work with them, and beginning with Athens, which doesn't have the same hang-ups that the other 3, Romania, Slovakia, and Spain does not have those. Begin with Athens. I gave example in there of where the US can broker a deal with Albania and Greece that as a condition, Greece would recognize Kosovo, and that would create some momentum. And let me just mention here, but so we don't debate this, that for Florian and others who are skeptical, there's a certain illogic about the skepticism. Because the skepticism says, oh, these non-recognizers, they won't change their view. And then they say, well, but Serbia is supposed to. And the logic is, who's more invested in this issue? These 4 countries or Serbia? And clearly, Serbia is the one that's far more invested in the question of recognizing or not recognizing Kosovo. And we're saying, well, we expect the country that is most invested in this to recognize first, but these other 4 who are less invested, well, that's impossible. We can't do anything. So that's first. The second thing is even approaching them, discussing this with them. It's not a binary that they have to immediately recognize or else there's no benefit. But having a discussion with them, asking these countries, what I recommended is taking their own concerns seriously. They have concerns in Slovakia and in Romania about the ethnic Hungarian minority. And those concerns are fanned and flamed by Viktor Orban. We share that interest with you, Bratislava and Bucharest. We share your concern. Let's work together. Let's isolate Viktor Orban on this. Let's protect you on these concerns that you have. But in return, your ambassador in Belgrade has to work with us to get Belgrade to come to a deal, not against us. So this is a dynamic. It's not just a binary they recognize or not. And that's an additional thing into the component. But the final one is, of course, I close on the point I opened, the US Capitol insurrection and the crisis of democracies. So for Alexander Vučić, if being pressed on democracy is not just some small matter that he can do, these are a threat to his power. He didn't eliminate and dominate the media for nothing, just as a hobby, to control virtually the entire media. He didn't do that just as a hobby. He didn't marginalize the opposition as a hobby. This is all part to consolidate his power. And democracy means unconsolidating your power in part. And that's a threat to him. So the challenge is, well, are we going to continue with the same mentality and say we avert our eyes to your democracy backsliding? We avert our eyes to your inflammatory remarks on Kosovo. We and charging the atmosphere. We avert our eyes to all of that if you'll only sign up to this dubious settlement on Kosovo. So that's the challenge. I think the wiser thing is to have a strategy that encompasses all of Europe, an all of Europe strategy on this, that encompasses the 4, if not 5 non-recognizers, and says, you know what, you're part of the problem, and you now need to become part of the solution. It's not enough just to sit on your hands and say, oh, well, Catalan. Sorry, you know, that's not good enough anymore. And we need to work together here. And we need to work together to resolve this, because this is a threat to European security and a threat to everything you say you stand for. So sorry to go on, Ryan, I hope that was answer to your question, but thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And I'm sure that we would be able to continue this conversation for the next 10 hours or so, discussing the transatlantic approach to the Balkans. I want to thank both of our panelists, Ed Joseph from Johns Hopkins SAIS and Florian Bieber from University of Graz in Austria. I'm now going to turn it over to the founder and publisher of Balkan Insider, Ari Middleman, for some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and I'll echo that. Thank you, panelists. It was a fascinating discussion. I think we have quite a bit to look forward to over the next year, and dare I say the next 4 years. I was also be remiss if I didn't thank all of our very diverse guests. There were many names I didn't recognize. So thank you for joining Balkan Insider. I think many of you the first time. As I said at the outset, we're the only morning newsletter covering this region. We definitely look forward to doing similar events, and we're welcoming any and all suggestions of panelists. So stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you again.
Thank you.